Gracious Lord, we thank you for your word. You've given us your word to reveal your heart to us, to give us direction, hope, peace, joy. You've given your word to teach us and guide us through this journey we call life. And then you gave us your word in flesh, that which we will celebrate in just a couple of days. Lord, may your word be fully alive in our hearts and lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Please be seated. So I'm going to start this morning by asking you all a question. What do you do when you've been following a star only to discover that you somehow wound up in a stable? The actress Helen Hayes once told the story of cooking her very first Thanksgiving turkey. She explained that she really wasn't a very good cook, and after several years of marriage, she decided to try to prepare a turkey on her own. She sat her husband and son down before the meal and said, "Look, this may not come out exactly the way you want it to. So, if it's not a good turkey, don't say a word. Just stand up from the table and we will go to the closest restaurant we can find to eat." A few minutes later, Helen Hayes walked into the dining room with the turkey and found her husband and son already standing with their coats and hats on. What we expect to get will often, if not always, influence the way we think and act. Anyone who has ever raised kids knows that it's not very hard to get them up on Christmas morning. In fact, most of us probably went to bed praying, "Oh Lord, please let them sleep in." But 1 week later, the day after New Year, when you're trying to get them up to go to school again, I don't know about you, but in my house it was a little bit like trying to raise the dead. So, just what are we supposed to do when we've been following the star, only to discover that somehow, some way, we wound up in a stable? A few minutes ago, we heard the story of some wise men who were following a star. But when they got to the end of their journey, what they discovered wasn't exactly what they were expecting. And that leads to a question. What do we do when all of a sudden, after thinking something wonderful was going to happen, we wind up in the backyard of a barn? Instead of finding a king on a throne in a palace, the wise men of Matthew's story found a baby wrapped in rags, born to a peasant couple in a feed trough. Can you just imagine their disappointment? After a long, difficult, and dangerous journey, they finally arrived in Bethlehem, expecting a king in a royal court. They even stopped at Herod's palace to look for this king. I think it's safe to say that every one of us has experienced following a star. Perhaps a star that we really believe that God placed before us. But when we got to the end of our journey, what we got was nothing like we were expecting. All along the way, everything looked incredibly promising to us. But when we got to our destination, we found that we were in a stable. Not long after losing my eyesight, I went away to Pittsburgh to a comprehensive rehab center. While there, I met a young woman named Jamie, who was also there because she had just lost her eyesight. Jamie had been a sophomore at Penn State. I'm told that she was breathtakingly good looking and very close to a 4.0 student. But one night while walking across campus, she was mowed down by a drunk driver. In addition to being totally blind, Jamie was also severely brain damaged. Anyone looking at Jamie just moments before that accident would have said, "There's a kid that's truly following a star. Her future is unlimited." But just a few moments after the accident, Jamie's friends and family were wondering if she had any future at all. College kids graduate with a diploma tucked under their arm, ready to go out and conquer the world. But far too often, they discover that the job they dreamed of wasn't quite the way they thought it was going to be. Pastors regularly stand before an altar to marry a couple. So promising, so beautiful. Everyone thinks that marriage has limitless possibilities. But just a few years later, over half of those marriages will be lying in ruins in divorce court. Lots of good, godly parents believe they're doing all the right things to raise their children and teach them to be godly, only to discover somewhere down the road that their kids have wandered far from the path to Christ that they tried so hard to show them. And I'm not talking about my kids. I'm talking about my parents. Maybe it's your job. Maybe you were expecting a promotion and a raise. But when the boss called you into his office, you find out that somebody else got the promotion. Perhaps he called you in to tell you you've been laid off. Perhaps he called you in to tell you that the company is closing down and your retirement savings are gone. You walk out of the office in a daze. You realize that even though you thought you were following a star, you wound up in a stable. I had a really good friend who had worked hard his entire life. Throughout those years, his wife had sacrificed enormously while he spent days on end on the road, week after week, month after month, and year after year. So as he approached retirement, they had great expectations and excitement. But literally, within a week or two of his retirement, his health began to decline. And within less than a year, he was dead. They thought they were following a star, but when they got to retirement, they discovered it was a stable. One of the many really beautiful parts of the Christmas story is what those wise men did when they came to that stable in Bethlehem. By looking at what the wise men did, we can discover three powerful things that we can do when we come upon the stables in our lives. Situations that just aren't quite what we were expecting. Lesson number one. When wise men or women come to a stable, they look for God. Wise people throughout the ages, when facing difficult situations, haven't panicked. They hold steady and they say, God is somewhere in the stable of life and there's something I need to learn here. I'm going to just stay steady because God has to be in this somewhere. One of the things I really like about the Bible is that the writers never tried to make the characters better than they really were. They just tell it like it really happened. Think of the patriarch Joseph from the Old Testament. He was a very wise man. He understood how to find good in horrible situations. Let's think for a minute about what he had gone through. He was sold into slavery by his brothers. In the new land of slavery, he was betrayed again while working in Potiphar's house. He was thrown into jail, went through one setback after another, but eventually God raised him up to be prime minister of Egypt. And when his brothers came back, they apologized. So what did Joseph say to them? You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. Joseph had the ability to see God in the middle of life's state. Think of Job, a good man, upright in the sight of God, but he found himself sitting on an ash pile, scraping boils with a piece of broken pottery. And what did his wife and friends say to him? Job, why don't you just curse God and die? But what did Job say? He said, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job still saw God in the stable of life. And then think about King David. He wrote Psalm 23 while hiding in a cave, having just fled from his own son who had overthrown David's throne and completely disgraced him. David was certainly a man who knew how to follow God's star, but on that occasion, he had absolutely found himself in a stable. But while there, he still had the ability to see God. This is one of the biggest differences between immature, weak Christians and mature, strong Christians. Weak or immature Christians think that when things are going well for them, God must be right there and blessing them. But when things are not going well, God has somehow abandoned them or is far away. Let me be absolutely clear here. Nothing could be further from the truth. Often, in fact, it's actually the devil that brings good things into people's lives in order to lead them astray. And I don't know about you, but there have been a whole lot of times in my life when in the midst of life's greatest hardships, God drew me the closest to Him. Wise, mature Christians know to look for God in both the good times as well as the bad, in both palaces and stables. When I was 18, I left home to follow a star. I went off to Syracuse University and eventually became a civil engineer. When I went to work for Boeing, I had incredible success. I thought things couldn't get any better. After a few years, I came back home and went into business with my father. It was awesome. And then one day, I realized I was going blind. I'd been following a star. I thought the star was leading to an incredible future. And then my world went dark, and I found myself in a stable. But in the stable of blindness, I began to see God far more clearly than I ever had before. Perhaps you're in a stable period in your life. You were following a star, and it looked really, really good, but then all of a sudden, you found yourself looking around going, wait a minute, is this it? How did I wind up here? Never forget, wise men and women have the ability to see God in the stables of life. Lesson number 2. When wise men and women find themselves in the stable, they give their very best to God. That's something that, quite honestly, doesn't come naturally for us. Instead of giving gold, frankincense, and myrrh when we find ourselves in one of life's stables, our temptation is to hold back. When we're expecting a palace and wind up in a stable, we're tempted to not give anything at all, much less our very best. When things are going well, people tend to get excited and they want to contribute to the success. But when things are going badly, often we pull back, get discouraged, or even quit. That's true in relationships. When relationships are struggling, we tend to pull back, to hold back on our feelings, and to not engage with that other person. When a high school sports team is experiencing success, the bleachers are filled and the fans are excited. Other kids want to be a part of the team and they want to be starters. But when things are going badly, the bleachers are empty, the comments are all negative, and no kid wants to sign up to be a part of a losing season. That very same phenomenon occurs in churches, businesses, families, and everywhere else. But when the wise men found themselves in the stable, they didn't withhold anything. They didn't look at each other and say, well, maybe we shouldn't leave the gold, frankincense, and myrrh here. Maybe we should take it back to Herod and give it to him. They did not say, oh gee, this is just a baby in a feed trough, and his parents are nobodies. We probably shouldn't give this stuff to him. The difference between ordinary and extraordinary people can be summed up in 3 words: and then some. People who are successful in every area of life, and for sure, great men and women of God, give their very best, and then some. They forgive people, and then some. They always go the extra mile. They always take the extra step. People who make a difference in this world are people who always give their very, very best. People who regularly make a difference don't ever say to themselves, well, I wonder what's the least I can get away with doing, or what's the least I can get away with giving. It does not matter if it's preparing and preaching a sermon or working in a factory. It does not matter if it's in the classroom, the athletic field, or even in a family. The mark of a Christian should always be that we go the second mile and always, always turn the other cheek. A wise man or woman always gives the extra effort, all for the glory of Jesus Christ. Lesson number 3. When wise men and women find themselves in a stable, they're willing to change their direction. Have you ever had a stable experience that really changed the direction of your life? I've had a few of those. When I lost my eyesight, I made the choice to draw closer to God than ever before. I also made the choice to continue going into work every day and doing the very best I could, working perhaps harder than I ever had before. Now, I've got to be honest here. For a while, that did not result in a whole lot. My best was really not very good, but I continued to try to get it. And when things started to turn around, it was great. But after 8 years of that, I felt God telling me it was time to follow a different star and change directions completely. So I left my construction business and went back to graduate school. Once again, the path looked really promising, but after graduating with a 4.0 average and winning all kinds of awards, I found myself in another stable, unable to get a job in any public school. Over the course of that year, I applied for 8 school counselor positions, only to see people who, without sounding too terribly arrogant, people who had half of my credentials get hired instead of me. Eventually, I just had to accept the reality that no blind person was going to get hired in any public school in this part of the country. For sure, I was confident that God had told me to follow that star, but I was in the stable and not where I wanted to be. So once again, I drew close to God. I continued to do my best, and then God had me totally change directions. That's when I opened a private counseling practice and began preaching in local churches. I quickly discovered that what began as a very unfair and discriminatory set of hiring practices had worked out really, really well for me. And I have no regrets whatsoever. I am way better off doing what I'm doing, way happier doing what I'm doing, finding what I'm doing way more fulfilling than I ever would have found any of those things as a high school guidance counselor. When you find yourself in the stables of life, search diligently for God in the midst of your situation. Draw close to Him. Give Him your very best, and be open to the possibility that He just might want you to totally change directions. I've read that Henry David Thoreau once walked out into Walden Pond until his eyes were just above the surface of the water, all so that he could see what the world looked like through the eyes of a frog. Now, I've got to be honest here. When I read that as a young man, I thought, how stupid. And more than that, who cares? But as I thought about that more recently, I thought, you know what? That's exactly what God did at Christmas. The God of the universe allowed himself to come into this world as a baby, born to a peasant couple. He looked through human eyes and grew up just like you and me, all so that he would understand us and know how to relate to us. If Christmas is anything, it's the story of God changing worlds and putting limits on himself. Christmas is the story of a newborn baby who was in reality far more powerful than the entire Roman Empire. The Roman Empire crumbled and collapsed. But that baby grew up to be a man who became the Savior of the entire world. When we come to the stables of our lives, let us follow the example of those wise men. Let us search diligently for God. Let us give him the very best that we have to give. And let us allow God to change the direction of our lives and allow us to become the men and women of God that he wants us to be. Let's pray. Gracious Father, we have to confess that we don't enjoy finding ourselves in the stables of life, especially when we're following a star that we know you put in front of us. But Lord, when we do that, teach us to seize the opportunity to search for and draw close to you. Lord, in those times, may we continue to give you our very best, no matter what. And may we always be open to changing the direction of our lives as we follow you and become the men and women of God that you so desire us to be. In Jesus' holy name we pray.